Well, hello, all participants, and I'm Bob Stevenson, Pig Vet, and may I extend my own welcome to the webinar entitled Pig Disease Prevention and Maximising Pig Performance. Now, the few slides in this presentation just illustrate and explain for us all the undoubted connection between the two headings, the sort of health and production and performance, and hopefully profit. So there are a few straightforward procedures that I'll suggest to both keep new pig diseases out from your pigs and prevent too much impact from those diseases which every pig farm has to cope with. The so-called, the homebred, that's not quite the right expression. It's termed endemic disease on the unit. They're grumbling diseases, which that is a sort of veterinary term, endemic. And by doing so, if we do that, your pig's health and the welfare, important of course, and the performance will benefit. So you get happy pigs growing well, and your unit, your outcome will be achieved, whatever that might be. And of course, that's for you to have decided what is the aim of your unit. So a few key procedures will benefit. A few key procedures can make a real difference. Now we'll get on with the few slides that follow, but just a reminder before we do that. Every single pig farm is bespoke or different, really. And so every situation with disease and keeping it out and health planning and so on will be different. I'll try and answer any questions as has been said at the end. Particular to your breed of pigs or the nature of your enterprise, and don't hesitate to ask any questions. So, disease prevention. Now, infections that aren't already existing in your pigs, and don't forget every pig unit has its, as I've said already, its own infections, those grumbling diseases that you have to contend with, but not present on the farm, is one aspect of what we're going to be talking about. Keeping them out. And infections that already exist on your farm, making sure their impact is controlled. And that's what, at the end of this seminar, I do hope you'll be able to put what I think are relatively straightforward procedures. They need a bit of thought and they need a little bit of managing, but nothing that's worth doing is perhaps without that sort of effort. So let's just look at some of the words that are actually used when we talk about these infections not present in your pigs. Yes, well, new. Exotic may well be notifiable, and we'll come to that. The notifiable diseases of pigs, and clearly African swine fever is one that I suspect you will all have heard about, and the anxiety from various pig organizations in the UK and elsewhere. Often these ones that you haven't got on your unit are likely to have major effects on pigs and their performance. They're often termed epidemic type disease, and we know in human beings the epidemic, those diseases which spread pretty quickly, very contagious then, and the role here with those diseases that you haven't got is biosecurity, keeping infections out. Now, if we move to the bottom infections already. There's a couple of questions there, aren't there? And if you look at that, the questions are, what is your unit profile? What does that mean? Question mark. Refer to your pig health plan. Have you got one? Now, those ones that are already existing on your farm should really be known to you. The sort of things that show up, and you will be very aware of the things with diarrhea or coughing or poor performance or scruffy pigs or this sort of thing. That's your unit profile. It can be detailed as a result of further tests or any post-mortems that have been carried out, and you will then have knowledge about your unit profile. Without that, the plans for controlling the impact of those is perhaps not as easy. And the pig health plan will detail, often written by in conjunction with Farming Connect personnel, advisors, or your unit vet, because it may involve certain procedures that it may involve vaccination or treatments. And the word here is biocontainment. It's a word that's, again, bio means live, so biosecurity means, keeping things out from the unit. Biocontainment means limiting the infections on the unit, right? So we all know that units have coughing and profit-sapping, costly treatments, vet interventions, and unless you're pretty careful, then there's money sort of going out, and you don't necessarily see the benefits and the joy of keeping pigs. So let's then look at what to do regarding the biosecurity and biocontainment. But before we do that, I'd just like to link the health and this maximizing performance of the title. There are disease cost calculators that have been done if you know the level of, for instance, the commonest smoker's cough in pigs, the sort of, and if I'm allowed to make an attempt at being a coughing pig, here goes. Variable, persistent, and oh, well, it must be the dust. But those pigs aren't performing. If you follow them through to the slaughterhouse, 90% of UK herds have enzootic pneumonia. You will see a picture. The calculation has been done for the cost of that. If you know how much pneumonia is there, and lungs can be scored. I won't go into the details. Similarly with these things, poor fertility, a return to service, rhinitis, other disease, worms and mange, they've all been actually calculated. But you won't know the effects unless you marry those incidents of treatment for scour, deaths or poor litters born, etc., unless you're recording. So let's face it, you've got to keep some sort of record, haven't you, about the number of deaths, reasons for deaths, growth rate, etc. If it's only in your book that you carry in your top pocket, that's the most vital piece, because it means it's relevant information. If we look at this table that's signaled on the right there, here, now this is big stuff, outdoor units, but it's these sort of measurements that we need to know. Okay, if you're not a breeding herd with litters per sow per year being important, then if you're having any breeding, then the born lives per litter and the pre-weaning mortality and how many pigs are weaned per litter is going to set your sort of benchmark, your target. Now, I'm not even suggesting that you should be trying to compete with this lot. These are hybrid, these are UK herds. 2018 with comparison to 2017, indoor and outdoor, and just look at those figures. But these are hybrid, highly genetic, very high health, virtually no existing clinical disease. And you can see that at 27 and 23 outdoor weaned per sow per year, that's even though there's an 11.2% mortality, we're still getting huge numbers of pigs. And when there's the investment in those sort of units, then not surprised. So the message there is we can calculate disease on your farm by these cost calculators once we know what we're dealing with, if it's enzootic pneumonia, for instance. And the second message is, please record what you're doing, because if you don't do that, you may be living a dream and you love pigs and you find them entertaining, etc., and perhaps you like the meat that they produce, or everyone does, but you may be losing money. I must mention, while we're considering the actual exotic diseases that I said might be notifiable, the African swine fever. The UK have classed it as medium risk now. It was always very low risk, never been in the UK. No vaccine yet, might get one. Working hard up in the north, trying to develop one, difficult. No treatment, slaughter policy, and it would be very, very damaging to the pig industry. And it's much feared, as you see here, that by the pig industry. Much feared. It comes in, if it does come in, by imported human food, illegally or legally. Yeah, we've reiterated that. Kitchen straps. Small pig keepers are blamed for using kitchen things to feed, feed pigs in the old-fashioned way. You mustn't do that. Anything that's been in a domestic kitchen, canteen, or anything must never ever be fed to pigs. We know that, don't we? Public rights of way can be a problem with well-meaning or ignorant, whatever you like to call them, people that have rights of way. And where is the nearby wild boar in nearest population? Because they are the pigs that carry it best. They die with it. They invade commercial units. Have a look at these photographs. If you see anything like that, what should you do is the question. You report it. If you're not sure whether it's reported, if you miss it, you're in trouble, because the wrath of all the pig keepers and neighbors and things. But you won't miss it. You'll have a word with your vet, and if he says, yeah, we better report that, and then it goes to your own local animal health office. Purple ears, a dull pig. Of course, it's a dull pig. This one, purple discoloration scrotum. Purple ears. Ever seen a duller pig? Very high temperature. And there's lacrimation there, tear staining, blinking conjunctivitis. It's not the only sign. Sudden death is often a characteristic. Suddenly there's a litter dead. And what is that, you might say? So, moving on and thinking about the big risk. The big risk is perhaps one of the big risks anyways, in the Forest of Dean. There are thousands of wild boar. Well, what's so concerning are the roadside food bins put out for the collection, which may contain scraps that have been in the freezer from perhaps something, a salami or something that you had on holiday, came back, put it in the freezer, forgot about it, and then it's thrown out. And African swine fever virus will last for over 2 years in the deep freeze. So those scraps sometimes end up here, and people are actually feeding boar in the Forest of Dean, and these boar are actually breaching pig unit biosecurity. We're talking about a boar that is that side. That's a Forest of Dean boar They're trying to reduce the population. Look at the height of that thing. And that actually is processed and served up as wild meat, wild boar meat in local butchers. So there's a trade here, and the shooters are quite interested in that trade, of course. So the message, and this is a French sign, the message is prudence, be careful. Anything to do with wild boars. Here it's because of road traffic accidents, but just be very careful about your biosecurity and what can you do. And the message here is, if you're a smaller pig keeper looking to feed appropriate vegetable materials and root materials and so on, fine, as long as it doesn't touch your kitchen. Moving on, and just a rehearsal very quickly about what the notable diseases are. And we all remember here foot and mouth disease in 2007. I remember 2007 very well. I was involved in the depth of it. 2001, I was involved in the depth. 1967 was horrific. And 2000 classical swine fever, African swine fever, never. And the others, well, some have and some haven't. And bovine TB is worth a mention. If you have cattle, then it can spread to the pigs, quite often from local wildlife sources or from cattle. And if it turns up in the pigs, they don't show any signs. It actually appears in the slaughterhouse. So that's just a rehearsal. If you suspect any of them, anything abnormal, have a word with your vet, or if your vet is not contactable or isn't knowledgeable at all about pigs, then you must go straight to the animal health, and you get an investigation which won't charge you, it won't cost you anything, but you just keep your fingers crossed, but you've done the right thing. Right, let's move on. Now, those infections that are on your unit or might be on your unit, the most serious ones are ones like swine dysentery, link there, look. Blue ear disease, that's an acute form. That's the blue ear disease of rough litter, a born. Awful farrowings, dreadful farrowings, smelly farrowings, no milk in the sows, an awful thing can be. It can also cause pneumonia and others. It's an immunosuppressing virus, so it has multiple effects. There is a vaccine, fortunately. Similarly, with this wasting disease you may have heard of, porcine circovirus, the wasting pig. That's an acute form. It's not a wasting pig. It's an acute form that's the same virus that causes death in pigs between 50 and 70 kilos, sudden deaths and with kidney failure. The more common one is wasting disease. Pigs that you think, well, they've got worms, I'll worm them, and you worm them again, you worm them again, and they do not improve, and they just waste away and die. These are endemic infections, and swine dysentery, interestingly, is trying to be eradicated under a producer scheme run by AHDB called the Diseases Charter, and you may care to check that out. Those are the serious ones you're trying to control on the unit if you're unfortunate enough to have it. And as I say, there are vaccines which will help you there. Swine dysentery is much more problematic because the antibiotics, most of them have become ineffective. Brachyspira, which is the cause of it, has found a way around it. We've only got one antibiotic now, hence the reason they're trying to actually get rid of it. The more common endemic infections, the ones you live with time and time and all over the world, that are more damaging than you may realize. Let's look at the pictures and see which one marries up with what. I've listed erysipelas, and everyone knows that erysipelas is one of these, and it's, which one is it? It's this one, is it not? The classic diamonds or palpable bumps on the back come up very quickly. Pig runs a temperature, but that's a very minor part of erysipelas. It's much more damaging internally, unseen, and people don't realize. They just think that treatment of this will sort it out. It does not. Mange is this one, and these are the little critters that do that. That's a Sarcoptes mange mite, and this is the end result in a working boar. Irritable pigs, want to eat each other, restless, won't convert, horrible looking, and you need to control that. That's one of the endemic infections that you must control, as are these critters. These are clearly, this is clearly spaghetti-like ascarid worms, the large roundworm, and they not only produce poor pigs, really poor pigs, but they produce damaged liver. This is milk spot in the liver that is condemned. It's not inedible, that liver, but it won't ever appear on a butcher's slab or anywhere else because, so they're rejected and there's a cost to that. And finally, the enzootic or endemic pneumonia, the smoker's cough of the pigs, excuse me again. These are normal lungs. This is a pneumonic lung. Look at that there. That's a collapsed lung. Will never ever reinflate. And you've got only a small capacity of that lobe left working up the top here. If you can see the pen pointer. So these are the ongoing endemics that don't have train your money. They need treatment and they are controllable. And we'll come, as I've said a couple of times already, to the practical side of how we actually do the practical importance. Just waiting for things to catch up. So the biosecurity, that's the ones that you don't want on. What you've got to do with biosecurity is assume that the pigs that you're perhaps bringing on now, that begs the question, what's your enterprise? Do you buy in gilts for breeding, or do you buy in weaners for growing? And I can't answer that for you because you're going to have to perhaps ask the questions at the end. So how do we gain confidence that the pigs coming on are not carrying some pretty nasty diseases, the list that we looked at with those exotic diseases, and something pretty horrible could come on, swine dysentery certainly, and we do have that in Wales, and we have had to kill units out because the effect on the pigs and the welfare and the cost is just untenable. You can't, and quite high pedigree herds too. So do you know where they come from? That begs the question. And if you don't, if you're buying them fairly blind because they're the sort of pigs you want, you've got to actually put all measures in. And the first measure to think of is a line of separation when these pigs or any other risk source arrives on your farm. I'll explain a bit more about this so-called line of separation. It's an interesting phrase, but and I'll give pictures to show what I mean. And there may be questions that you want to ask about it. But having decided a line where something has to be done to stop, let's say, the fallen stock lorry coming on, or the vet's lorry, the vet's truck coming on, or your own trailer back from, well, wherever, market possibly with pigs on board because you've collected them, that something has to be done there. I'll come back to that. The next slide that should be, the next point that should be, is the risk vehicles. Whose vehicles are risky? Well, I think you can probably guess that. I've mentioned the vet, the knackerman, the feed delivery, pig farmers who want to come on and be pigs, maybe, all that. Those are risk vehicles. Don't let them pass that line of separation. Now here, I'm pausing on this slide because this is the nidus of the whole webinar. This is the center, this is the focus. If you don't know the health source, and these days most units that buy regular gilts or pigs, growing pigs for further finishing, from units need to know what the health profile, that word again, of the pigs that are coming on is. Otherwise, you don't know what you're buying in, and you don't know how they're going to react to your infections on your unit. So that would be really wonderful to know. But looking somebody in the eye and saying, are your pigs, free of disease, or what's the health profile, or what vaccines do you use, is not that easy. And do you get the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? We don't know. So assume that they may be carrying, let's say, blue ear disease and wasting disease for a start. You've got to actually have something to check with those vehicles, stop them. You've got to isolate any incoming pigs. Pigs are the biggest source of infection. We'll talk about what other risks there are, but pigs are the biggie. Vehicles are pretty next in line. Pigs are the biggie in terms of risk. And then you've got to, after you've actually isolated them, and the questions arise, where do I isolate, for how long, and what do I do? That's not a big difficulty, and I'll explain. Integration is the next one. What does that mean? It means after isolation, you then get the pigs that have been wonderfully isolated and they've actually come up with nothing to show. You might have even tested them to be sure. You might have run tests on them when they're in isolation. But now you go to the next stage of integrating them with the infections that your pigs have got. So they've got to get to know you. It's a getting to know you place, the integration. These are two separate things. If you don't do those, and you just shove them in isolation and say, yeah, they were in isolation, and then we introduced them because I needed the boar, or I needed something sort of on the unit, and then you haven't integrated them, and bang. And particularly young boars, if you buy a young boar and you haven't isolated to check that he's not brought anything in, as far as you can tell, and then integrated them, the boars particularly go down with a big bump. And there you are saying, well, I paid some money for that boar, and he's actually not performing. Just remember that if you can, the health profile of them coming on, yes or no. Where is your line of separation, and what do you do with vehicles? Then where do you isolate? I'll give you some examples. And what do you do in isolation? And then what about this integration? What the heck do we do in that? What does that mean? Right. Biosecurity actions then. Where, why, for how long, and what is involved, and who's doing things for your pigs in isolation? Is it you, or is it somebody else? Provocative questions. Here we go. Where isolation doesn't need to be fancy. It just needs to be out in a paddock that's not nose to nose, and it's perhaps 3 meters, or at least not in the same airspace. If you're an indoor unit like this one at the bottom here picture, they're put in a fairly rough place away from the main pig unit. These are hybrid gilts that come in 30s or 40s, so replacement gilts to well, what was the biggest unit in Wales? It was about 400 sows, up to 400, 340, something like that. They used to bring in batches of hybrid gilts, and this was their initial isolation. What about that one there? That's the sort of thing your stockman would be looking for. Or if you don't employ a stockman, then actually get someone with a few stock houses about them to actually look at them. You shouldn't really be looking at them yourself unless you actually look at them in the proper way round your pig unit, first or last, best last, and look for that sort of a pig there. And get him up and do things and make sure, and take his temperature perhaps if you can manage that, and be all eyes and ears looking for new signs here, because they're in a different place, they're on a different feed, they've been jerked in the lorry, and they're there for how long? 3 weeks. There's the for how long up there, look, third dash down, 3 weeks. Why do you do that? You cannot risk them galloping into your unit, and I need the boar, or I need the gilts bred, or I need these young growers into the growing shed to make up the numbers, and you will catch a big, they will catch a big cold, you will catch a big cold metaphorically, and it'll cost you a lot of money. So how long? 3 weeks at least. That's the incubation period for most diseases in this sort of area. Stock person observations, there's got to be some sort of protocol where you're not going there with your dusty overalls or your dirty boots to have a look around over the gate and say, yes, everything's fine, and move on. That's not what it's about at all. So that's isolation, quarantine, sometimes called, of pigs coming in with different infections. Then we get to this integration thing where we've got to marry up pigs that have survived this with no problems at all. Great. They come in and they've got to somehow meet infections from your unit. So you can actually do vaccinations to make sure that they're resistant to they're immune to the diseases you know you've got. And I would always say on units, erysipelas and parvovirus for breeding gilts is a must, and then erysipelas for ongoing use. It's very, very cost beneficial, and the complexities of erysipelas are huge. You may have be sampling for new disease to be sure that when you finally bring them onto the unit, and I am talking about units of reasonable size, anything from, well, any size really, if you're producing good quality product and people want your pigs or your pig meat, then anything really, you should do these 2 stages. You might sample to be sure. That's a real insurance, breathe a sigh of relief, the blood that can be taken. And if your vet takes blood and actually sends them to certain labs, you can get that done pretty cost effective, if not free. And then vaccinate them in integration. If you use the wasting disease vaccine, which 70% of herds in the UK do, at least 70%, then to avoid the potential for wasting pigs, then that's the time to do it. For how long? I would say probably another fortnight. So you're talking about having somewhere, a paddock somewhere, or this sort of area somewhere, or a paddock just out with electric fence that's security and away and being managed differently, then you're talking about 5 weeks, aren't you? It's so essential, but it needs a bit of thought. Where the heck and how and who's going to do it? You've got to work these things out. Some of the practical things, the line of separation we've talked about, and these 2 are, if you look at the top 2 there, this one here, no entry beyond this point. Now that's so clear cut, and they can be obtained. It was BPEX, but they can be obtained, and I think Farming Connect used to have a store of them, but you'll have to clarify that. No entry beyond this point, and please call, but whatever your phone number is. And this is not just big stuff. For small units in Wales, and I know well the cost of not having something like that and having a pig lorry or a fallen stock lorry arrive in amongst your pig buildings or your whatever you've got to keep your pigs in and bringing disease in, and the repercussions are huge. So you've got to actually have that and put your telephone number there and have your mobile switched on. This, just a practical point, if you're using foot tips, which I would certainly recommend as part of biosecurity and biocontainment in and around the unit, especially in the farrowing house, make sure it's lidded. Make sure that you use a DEFRA-approved disinfectant that's active against pig diseases, something like Virkon S or Pharmasan 30, the iodophor. Dilute it carefully, that's a 3-gallon volume, work out the measurements, and then close the lid so it doesn't get diluted. And that will last a week, even though it'll be contaminated. That just dipping is no good. You actually still remain with swine dysentery in the cleats of that boot there. So if that chap goes onto the unit and the wet stuff that he's just dipped in the boot is still hanging on there, he goes into this building here, into this pen round the corner, and the stuff goes off. We've actually brought in swine dysentery. One simple move, probably about ½ centimetre of pig slurry attached from a swine dysentery pig to the bottom of his boots. But what am I saying? I'm saying use a brush. Have a hoof pick. Hoof pick is great. A horse hoof pick will get into the cleats. You've got to be able to bend your back. You've got to be willing to. But that's the sort of foot tip. I put this photograph up for obvious reasons. This is the risk point of any unit, the pickup and delivery. If you've got place where you can shut, deliver, loading ramp down, don't let the lorry driver come off his lorry and help you. You've got to do it. You mustn't let the lorry driver, because the pedals in his lorry will be full of pig bugs likely. And if he comes on even stepping that way, you've then got to be absolutely sure that you've got disinfectant and a water supply there to actually get it back off the unit, his straw from his lorry. Make sure it's your straw, or if you need straw to unload your pigs, think seriously about that area. It's a brilliant sort of pick up and drop off point there. And here's a sort of plan of a farm. Here there's a carcass disposal bin at the end. There's a loading bay that comes down there, and the dirty pickup, or this sort of thing is there. The clean entrance for personnel is here in through showers. This is high, very high health. I'm not suggesting you need to do all that. I'm not suggesting you need to have concrete everywhere. I'm suggesting, and that's a small unit, that's a pedigree Welsh pig unit that actually has all these in place, and by Jove, hasn't he just reaped the reward. Getting towards the end, and thank you for your attention thus far, hopefully, and you're writing down any questions you want answered. And I'm now moving to the final couple of slides. Biocontainment, you know what that is now. It's on the unit now. You're on the unit. How do you operate to best effect without spreading disease on the unit? You never move from older pigs back to the babies. If you've got a farrowing area, let's call it, or a farrowing unit, let's call it, or a farrowing shed, stable, whatever it is, you want to be handling those first in the day. By the way, in terms of spotting signs for pigs in your isolation or anywhere else, change your routine and don't go with the bucket. Don't go at the same time every day, because they'll all be up and shouting and waiting for food. I mean, you will get indication, but by the time they show at that time, they really are ill. If you're looking for early warnings, especially spotting pigs in isolation, then do it at a different time of day. Creep up on them, spy on them, see how they're lying, breathing, huddling, standing, coughing, and doing whatever they're doing. But spy on them. Don't take food and don't make a noise. Spy on them. Early warnings will give you rewards because you'll spot things early. Just mark the pig with a Marco spray. Come back and see him later on. Pig compartments means that pigs of the same age should be kept more or less together. Never, ever put older pigs that haven't done quite so well and may be ill or carrying something back into young pigs. So when you're moving around the unit, move from young pigs to older pigs. So it goes farrowing house, it goes weaners it goes, growers, finishers, and dry sows. Keep pigs in small groups if you can, uniform. Don't mix and match. Don't. You'll not do well out of that. Your general hygiene, foot baths in the farrowing house, your general hand hygiene, all the basic hygiene things. Upskill your hygiene. Have plenty of boiler suits. You need separate gear for the isolation for sure. You cannot take your same boots, even if you're just leaning over the paddock fence or the pen wall, or having to walk a bit, because they will be separated. They should be not in the same airspace and separated from your own pigs by a certain distance. And then biocontainment, controlling your on-farm disease, relies these days on, there are a lot of vaccinations in pigs, but use them as according to hopefully your pig health plan. There's no case now really for preventive antibiotics. We've learned that lesson, so costly because there's multiple resistance in a lot of pig bugs, and you know the push from the human people that the major problem of antibiotic use in large groups of stock comes from pigs now, because there was a terrific amount of antibiotic used in feed, and that's created certain misconceptions, but the public and the WHO and everyone else is saying, and if you look at swine dysentery, for instance, and some of the E. coli scours, they are resistant to most antibiotics now. So we're now having to come to a vaccination, a post-antibiotic era. The message with antibiotic is use as much, as little as necessary, but not as much as possible. In other words, as little as necessary, but not as much as is possible. Never use antibiotics just in case. Oh, I've got some of this white stuff, I'll give it a jab because last time somebody gave it a jab, and so on and so forth. You know the sort of thing I'm talking about. And outdoor units, they can, that little outdoor unit way up in the hills, in a valley, one of the valleys or in South Wales, produces really cracking pigs, woodland pigs, cracking pigs, quite a number of pigs, about 30 sows, something like that. I mean, for these sort of units. Outdoors, well considered, good biosecurity, good biocontainment, an entry point, and they've established a line of separation, and they've got this sort of gear at their line of separation. Finally, just remember the trailer drop-off, that's a high risk. The feed delivery can be, ask for first delivery if you can. Footpaths going past there, perhaps need signage, do not feed the pigs. Where are the nearest pigs, and are they downwind or upwind? Because pneumonias and flu, pig flu will spread. And where are these days, where are the feral pigs or the wild boar? And do you get escaped pigs visiting? And very nearly the end, final chart, which shows the difference between hazard and risk. Here at the top there, we've got, if I can get my pointer, there we are, hazard and risk. The hazard, when I talk about the pigs being a hazard, they're also the highest risk. What's the chance of that hazard producing a major adverse impact? High. Pigs are first in the league table. Your trailer or somebody else's trailer, high risk, second, I've put it. Other vehicles, fallen stock, pet pig farmer, your own trailer, don't forget, that's quite often the biggest risk. If you've been to market or picked up pigs yourself, you come breezing into the unit, you've got to behave as if you're a visitor. Third, rights of way, they get blamed a lot. It's those walkers, isn't it? Yes and no, because they may think that the pigs need some food. because pigs are always hungry. Other animals, well, yes, cattle and very moderate. And where's the nearest pig disease? So that really gives you a little taster for those two control methods. One is biosecurity, and what the other is biocontainment. The bio means live. You've got to control the impact of live pig diseases. In this case, it applies to all species, really, whether you've got cattle and sheep as well. But it's eminently possible to save yourself one huge amount of money with those small procedures. Thank you very, very much for your attention, and I've rabbited on a little bit longer than I had intended. Thank you.